afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Mary Barrowman. I'm a senior economist at the International Center for Research on Women, and I'm also the Online Events Committee Chair for IAFFE. I want to warmly welcome you today on behalf of the Online Events Committee. Today's event is part of an ongoing Fireside Chat series, which provides the opportunity to do deep dives with IAFFE scholars on their work, including books that have been recently released, which we'll be discussing one of Stephanie's books today. We also have online events and numerous other event tracks, so please look out for more information regarding those and catch up on past events that you may have missed on IAFFE's YouTube channel. Go ahead and post a link to that in the chat in a minute. As with those past events, today's event will be recorded and posted to IAFFE's YouTube. Just some quick reminders, this is a Zoom meeting and not a webinar, so a friendly reminder to please keep yourself muted. But we will have a Q&A session section of the event later in the session, and that time we will invite you to either use the raise hand function, or you're welcome to post comments and questions throughout the session in the chat, and we will keep track of those. You're also welcome to put in resources that may come up that are relevant in the chat throughout. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our moderator for today. Sheba Tejani is a lecturer of international development at King's College London and a member of the IAFFE board. Her work is centered on the distributional consequences of international trade and structural transformation in developing countries. She is interested in the effects of technological upgrading, automation, and gender segregation on workers and the future of work. She has studied labor market inequalities in the context of structural change, export-oriented industrialization, and global value chains in the global South, which makes her an excellent fit for today's event. In a related and emerging research program, she explores the consolidation of Hindu majoritarianism in India and its relationship to development and exclusion. She was recently awarded a senior research fellowship from the American Institute of Indian Studies to support this work. And she also has a PhD in economics from my alma mater. I got the chance to study with her from the New School in New York. So I'm going to go ahead now and turn it over to Sheba to get the things started and introduce Stephanie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Mary, for the introduction. I'm really delighted to be here and to join you all for this talk. And I'm particularly honored to be the one hosting this talk with Stephanie, because Stephanie's work has been such an important source of inspiration for my own research on gender and work and global value chains. I've drawn on her scholarship extensively. And, just to say quickly, the things that I really admire about Stephanie's work is that, unlike many of us economists, she actually goes to the field. She tests her theories. She actually interacts with the people that she's researching. Her work has tremendous practical and policy value. And of course, she focuses on gender inequalities, which so many of us will agree is very critical. So to introduce Stephanie, Stephanie is an Emeritus Professor in the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. She has researched and published widely on gender, agribusiness and employment in global value chains, trade and labor standards, corporate social responsibility, fair and ethical trade, and business and human rights. She has undertaken research in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe. She was coordinator with Professor Gary Jaraffi of Capturing the Gains research program, examining decent work in global value chains in different sectors across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. She's held a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship to write the book we are going to be discussing today, which is Gender and Work in Global Value Chains, Capturing the Gains, which was published by the Cambridge University Press in 2019. She was research lead on an FCDO DFID program on work and opportunities for women. She also led a GCRF and ESRC research project titled Shifting South on Decent Work in Regional Value Chains in Africa. She has advised a number of companies, NGOs, government and international organizations, including Body Shop, Cadbury, DFID, Marks & Spencer, Vigo, UNCTAD, and many others. So warm welcome to you, Stephanie. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And to get us started and kick us off, it would be great if you could perhaps share with us, what got you interested in feminist economics and particularly in this topic of gender and global value chains.
Great, thanks very much. And thank you to both Mary and to you, Sheba, for this opportunity to participate in the Fireside Chats, which I think are a really great, a great kind of events as part of the kind of IAFFE program. So just in terms of the question, I've long had a personal interest in promoting gender equality, addressing inequalities. I did my degree and then PhD in political economy, so economics department. So I come originally from that background, but my focus was on equal exchange and trade, not with a gender focus in my PhD, but realizing that clearly there were massive gender inequalities in trade, but at that time quite difficult to address. I got involved in the early 1990s in field research, initially in Chile. I was very interested in the 80s and early 90s. There was a lot of talk about the Chilean economic miracle. This great success story. It was all export driven, free market. It was all brilliant. My research really, I knew that behind this so-called miracle, there were very large numbers, hundreds of thousands, at the absolute peak, of temporary, largely female workers, las temporeras. And they were literally unrecognized. They didn't exist. I even wrote an article about how Chilean fruit was miracle fruit because it grows itself, it harvests itself, and it pops along. It packs itself and sends itself out. But of course, as soon as you've brought the full data in, then you realize that there are this very large number of women workers. So that was my initial kind of interest in research at the field level to really understand what was going on. But while I was doing the research in Chile and interviewing workers, and I soon discovered you really don't know a lot if you don't understand a lot, if you don't interview workers. I was quite astounded, and my Spanish isn't that good. It's learnt Spanish when they kept mentioning this word Tesco, and I asked what's Tesco, and they fell about laughing, saying, well, it's the UK supermarket. Who do you think it is? Me coming from the UK. And this was in the very early 90s, and I was astounded. Why would Tesco be going thousands and thousands of miles across? And the reason they all knew about the Tesco visit once a year was there was a toilet, but the toilet was only available to them during the Tesco visit. As soon as the Tesco visit was over, the toilet was closed for the rest of the year. Wow. So I was just dumbfounded by this. I went back and then I interviewed Tesco, and Tesco really were the first people that those interviews really explained to me how their value chain works, that they directly coordinate right the way through suppliers to suppliers. They don't use remote intermediaries anymore, and that food hygiene really matters, hence the inspection of the toilets. I didn't dare tell them that it's closed the rest of the year, but this was a long time ago. And then following that, I then came back to the UK, and then I really got involved more trying to analyse this process. So I became aware of the work of Gary Gireffi and other researchers on commodity chains. It became value chain analysis. And also, I was already aware, but found combining that with the work of feminist political economy, particularly Diane Nelson and Ruth Pearson's work, but many others as well were beginning to look at women workers in global production, and that putting those two together kind of gave me insights that I wouldn't have had otherwise, but also led to me a very early question. Well, if Tesco can inspect the toilets, why can't they also inspect the really poor working conditions, long hours, arduous work that these women have to undertake? So that kind of also led me into issues around fair trade, ethical trade, etc.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that arc, of your very prolific research career. And for me, I'm struck by the fact that you've accumulated such a breadth of experience through your fieldwork, right, and spread across so many continents. There's, I think, scarcely a person who would be better qualified to speak on gender and how gender operates in global value chains than you. And I was wondering then, why you think there has been such little focus on gender within global value chain research, considering that women make up the bulk of workers. You know, in some global value chains, such as apparel, it's 60 to 80% of workers. In others, it's less. So one would think that if you focus on workers' rights, if you're interested in decent work, this was this would be the first thing that would jump out at you. And yet we see that you are one of the few researchers who've actually focused consistently and squarely on this question for so long. And I was wondering why you think the focus on gender has been so minimal in this field.
Yes, I think that there's a lot of work on gender and a lot of work on research on workers, often with a gender focus. And then separately, there's a lot of research on value chains. The problem is that often those two bodies of research don't get sufficiently linked, in my view. Just focusing on the value chain piece, economists have been gender blind, as all members of IAFFE will be very aware, for a very long period of time, and it's been a big battle for feminist economists to address that gender blindness. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the issues with the value chain research is that the academic research on global value chains, especially, is a lot of it is very focused on firms and interrelationships between firms, how firms coordinate, because the key difference between a more traditional market is you have a lot of remote intermediaries which is quite difficult to trace what's going on and ultimately who's responsible for production versus sale along the whole set of connections. But in a value chain, the lead firm coordinates in detail, right down, as you've just told you, down to the toilets that are used by the workers on the premises. So this kind of whole notion of highly coordinated inter-firm relationships was a kind of fairly new dimension to research, which a conventional economist largely ignored for a very long time, until the last 5 or so 10 years, or even less than that, 5+ years. But I think those researchers that did get involved, many of them came from industrial sociology, some came from business. Their focus on firms meant that they just tended to overlook labor and overlook gender as well, completely overlook often. I mean, sometimes to the point that I would really be in meetings and I think some would get a bit fed up with me saying, what about the workers? What about the women? But one thing that I did find very, very interesting early on in my research and interviewing firms along the value chain is that the commercial firms were aware of gender, where the researchers, the academic researchers might not be, but the commercial firms were. And the reason is, quite simply, they were after profits. Now, if you're coordinating a value chain, who are your main consumers? Primarily women. Who are the main workers in the chain? Primarily women. If you don't keep an eye on the gender dimension, you're not going to be as profitable as you would otherwise. So for all the wrong reasons, the irony for me, unintended outcome of analysing the dynamics of the value chains was to spot that and then realise that it was something that we really needed to understand better.
Right. So in that sense, the commercial firms are pointing us to the direction that we need to be looking at more closely. And I'm also wondering whether, the focus of the global value chain literature on development strategies and upgrading, and more narrowly on economic upgrading, right? Because there have been some successful examples in East Asia, that the focus has been primarily that, and the strategies that firms can adopt, that gender has been sort of a secondary concern, So that's really interesting what you're saying. And, your book brings together 20 years of your research, and it is a real contribution both in terms of the theoretical framework that it develops, as well as the empirical data that it brings to bear. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about, what motivated you to write this book and write this particular book. And, as a field researcher with so many years of experience, I'm sure going in the field itself, right, is a moment both of discovery as well as doubt, and so many of the assumptions that we often have when we are studying these things from a distance are tested when we are in the field, right? And then we have to kind of reassess where we're at, whether we have the right idea, maybe sometimes even reframe our questions. And I'm wondering if you would like to share with us, not only your motivation behind writing this book, but also if you had particular assumptions that were challenged when you were in the field, and what kind of new complexities did you discover in that process?
Yeah, no, I think it's, I mean, as you say, the book was really an opportunity to draw together research done over many years in different countries and in different research networks and on different types of value chain. And the problem of as an academic is that a lot of the writing is then up of that individual project or individual research. Right. But what the book did was to really give me an opportunity to compare all these different types of value chains and really kind of draw out what the implications were. And I think I should say that, I mean, the work of Gary Gireffi, for example, has been very much on the economic upgrading in global value chains. But the collaboration I did with him was really important to, hopefully for both of us, certainly for me, because we were able to make by bringing together people with different forms of expertise, able to then make the connection between the economic dimension, the commercial dimension of value chain dynamics with the social dimension, and for me, very important within that agenda. So I think that's where that collaboration was very important, and with a big network of researchers involved, because none of this you can do on your own. I've always had, well, I learned very early on, you really have to have strong collaboration with researchers across countries if you really want to delve down across all parts of the value chain. So I think the book really allowed me to bring together all those different studies, tell stories in journal articles. You can't wander off and tell stories, but also, which are often of interest, but also I think very important to help to advance the analytical framework within which these interactions, the economic and the social, were taking place. The title of the book very deliberately, Gender and Work in Global Value Chains, Capturing the Gains, question mark. That question mark is really critical. And again, I think IAFFE researchers and many researchers on global production, there have long been debates about, as women engagement in global production, this has generated millions of jobs, 60 million jobs in garments alone, textiles and garments, for example, it's estimated across the globe, many in countries that traditionally women were unable to work. But yet this work is often very degraded work and very poor conditions, but not always. So I think a key thing then was really to try and understand more systematically when do women gain advantages and gain benefits from this work, and when is it and why is it more exploitative? And critically, I think, is from a kind of analytical perspective, to go back to that original point that I raised earlier, why would companies be interested in gender? I was really surprised by it. But why? What are the dynamics? What's the dynamics of value chains? And to really understand how companies really monitor those value chains across every element, the big ones, the really big ones. Both the consumer side, but also the producer side, the production side, and to understand how that works. And conventional economics told you very little about it. A value chain analysis does. So I think it was to help to take that forward. I think we've still got a very, very long way to go, but it was hopefully a contribution building on all those different research projects, separate research projects, to advance thinking in this area.
No, absolutely. And if you want to also quickly share with us any of the assumptions that you had, about gender and work that were challenged in the field, that would be great.
Yes, I think the main assumptions go back to that kind of very early research. By the time I wrote the book, there was some new research went into the book, certainly analytically, very much so, but also some new empirical research went into the book. But it was also gathering the different projects together. And I think, that first very early assumption I had when I went out into Chile was that women working for multinational companies was going to be awful, and that their conditions were so bad. And what I soon discovered was that the ones working for multinationals actually often had better conditions and pay than the ones working for the local domestic companies, even for in export companies. But also women themselves put me to write, because I was kind of asking all these slightly loaded questions about how awful work is. And I'll never forget in one focus group discussion, this very strong woman who'd been quite dominant turned around to me. She said, "We have always worked hard. Now we're being paid for it." And I think that really took me into this notion that actually, even though it can be hard, it can also be empowering. And as the work of many other researchers, such as Nala Gabir and many others, have shown, that there can also be very empowering dimensions to it, despite the problems. So the issue for me then was how to address the problems. Where is the leverage? Where can we go with it?
Right. No, absolutely. And in that sense, your work around labor standards and global chain governance is, I think, very relevant because, it's very sort of the common understanding it is correct that there are certain limits within which one can push for greater labor standards, for higher quality of work within the framework of global value chains because of the mobility of capital. That, if you push too hard, you organize, you push for higher wages, better working conditions, firms will simply pack up and go elsewhere. But I think what's interesting about your work is that you show, it's not so black and white, and that it's a more nuanced picture, and that there are different strategies that one can use at different moments, different points of leverage that can be used and that have been successfully used, by different groups of workers in different sectors. So I was wondering if you would like to say more about that, about how workers organizations, what are the strategies that can be used really to further workers' rights in the context of global value chains?
Well, I think one, just to pick up on the point that you made, I think you do, if you're really analysing value chains, they are quite complex. They're not just one size fits all at all. A very big difference in your own work. You've done a lot of work around garments and other sectors. I've looked at garments and agri-food probably in the most detail, but also footwear and tourism and other sectors as well. But just comparing garments and agri-food, garments is very footloose. There's always the risk that the buyers can just uproot and move to another country, and they often do that. Agri-food and agriculture is far less footloose, much more difficult. It depends on natural conditions, soil, a whole number of factors, climate, etc., as to whether you can grow a crop in a particular place or not. And I think even within the garments, which is highly footloose, you do have to differentiate between different categories of worker as to whether women benefit or don't, but also very importantly, this issue of economic upgrading. This is where the collaboration with Gary Jeffrey and others has been so important, because what we found is that where firms have economically upgrade or do economically upgrade, where they can raise productivity, they can produce higher quality goods, they can often provide work which is better quality work. They need better quality workers because they're having to meet much more complex standards and requirements. And they pay better in order to attract and retain those workers. But there's also this whole process of economic downgrading of other firms that in the book I call the high road versus the low road. There are also other firms which are on table, don't attempt to economically upgrade in any way, and who really focus on low wage, low cost work, and that's where you're probably going to get the most exploitative conditions, and particularly large numbers of women workers who are treated as disposable labour. So I think you do have to differentiate in order to understand where the opportunities are and where they're not. In agri-food, much less mobile, but in garments there's more recognition of women workers. We do have data on women workers in agri-food, particularly in low-income developing countries. The majority of agricultural production is undertaken by small-scale producers, small-scale farmers, and in very traditional forms of farming often, in countries where land ownership is primarily male, and where the role of women is largely overlooked or ignored, and where it is involved, it's unpaid contributing family labour. So it's a much more complex situation. But I did find, again, that through doing the kind of research, analysing some of my research was commissioned, particularly in cocoa, which I did a lot of work on, was commissioned by Cadbury, because they were trying to understand the sustainability of their cocoa value chain in Ghana, and they had a lot of problems with risk of declining cocoa output, etc. So with the University of Ghana, we did a big research project looking at it, and I was constantly told that cocoa it's a male crop. Why are you interested in gender? And I was, no, you bring me in, you're going to get the gender bit, even if that's the finding, it's a male crop. And when we really did the breakdown of all the work that was undertaken, what we found was that women were very involved, but they were very involved, particularly in the early crop. Very early, when the seedlings are first planted, they did the early care of the seedlings, and in the post-crop care, fermenting and drying of the cocoa beans. When we took this back to Cadbury, I'm not an agronomist, I hadn't fully realised the key issues or challenges they faced were low yields and poor quality. And then suddenly what we were saying was, well, yeah, but the people who do responsible for the yields is because a lot of that is a result of early crop care and the post-harvest activities. Women are actually most involved. And yet they had been constantly, they said, but we've been training all the farmers on this and they just don't listen. So we said, well, who are you training exactly? Because it was the men. So they then implemented a much more gender-focused strategy, and Mondelez, when they bought Cadbury's, have continued with that. So I think it's really understanding those nuances and using that to kind of find how you could leverage better support for women workers, in that case at smallholder level. But also, very importantly, I think, it is also, all of that has been helped ultimately by civil society campaigns, because ultimately, all around the same time that we were doing this kind of research, Oxfam was building up its campaign on Behind the Brands, which targeted companies specifically on their gender strategy. So Cadbury and later Mondelez definitely were able to pull together and say, yes, we have got a gender strategy and we do think this is important. So I think ultimately kind of it's how you push the research forward, or you use the research to provide insights that help you to leverage change or help others to leverage change. I'm not a company, I'm not an NGO, but hopefully I think that kind of nuanced understanding helps to find the points.
No, thanks for those very concrete examples, Stephanie, because your research is also so important because you're really using it to make change in the spaces that you're studying. So we can really see that in the case studies that you've been sharing here. And I'm aware that we are sort of running short of time. I had a lot of responses to what you're saying, but I'm just going to push ahead and sort of keep that aside for now, because we do want to leave some space and time for questions from the audience. But I thought we might also take this opportunity to ask you perhaps to reflect on some of the contemporary challenges that we've seen in the last few years. The world has changed quite dramatically, as we all know too well. COVID has brought the vulnerabilities of global value chains into sharp focus like never before. We've been, seeing this sort of the geopolitical tensions simmering. In one case, it's actually led to, an invasion and things between the US and China, the growing trade protectionism, other disputes, the rise of friendshoring, etc. I mean, some have actually sort of question whether this is going to lead to a greater deglobalization and whether there's going to be a reshoring, friendshoring, and what implications this would have, for instance, on women workers and all workers, in fact, in global value chains. So I just wanted to give you, I know it's a very broad-ranging question, but just wanted to give you a chance to perhaps pick up any of these themes and share your reflections on them.
Yes, I think, clearly we live in very, very challenging times. We've had the COVID rapidly followed with that big supply chain disruptions, particularly coming out of China, but elsewhere as well. And with knock-on effects throughout the global supply chains. And then also, of course, we've got the geopolitical tensions, particularly between China and the US, and then we've got the war in Ukraine, and other wars as well. That's not the only war, that tends to get focused on. So yeah, very, very challenging times, and a lot of the outcomes I think are ultimately going to be political, but focusing in on the value chain dimension to them, which is where my specialism is, and many others are much better informed on the broader issues than I am. I think the first thing, there was an argument that post-COVID that there was a hope that there would be a building back better, or a building back more equitably. I did write a piece for WOW specifically on this, and I think that just hasn't happened. In fact, I think from the research that we're getting, and clearly in a very difficult circumstances globally, what you're actually seeing is that many of the big multinational buyers are putting ever more pressure onto suppliers to reduce costs, to produce faster, and that is going to have adverse implications for workers, because it's only workers that the suppliers can really squeeze, and that's the only way they've got control. So in that respect, it's not very good findings or very good outlook. But at the same time, I think the other thing is this whole issue of deglobalization. Well, the research I've been involved in, and this goes right way back to Capturing the Gains, which was between 2008 and 2012 that we did that research. We already were picking up in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the rapid growth of regional and domestic value chains in those areas, in those locations. And when I say that, I mean where production was being coordinated by lead firms within Africa, Asia, and Latin America, often for markets within those same continents. In other words, increasingly, it wasn't just for the sort of the global south producing for the global north, but there was a much more complex interaction taking place, and then expanding trade between Africa, Asia, and Latin America, between the so-called countries of the global south. So we were already picking that up, and the last project I did, we did a lot of work on Africa. I focused in specifically on African regional value chains with the universities of Cape Town and Nairobi, and there we saw rapid expansion within Africa, which is meant to, many of the sub-Saharan Africa meant to be the lower income countries. But we saw, with clear exceptions, in terms of some of the countries, but we saw clear changes taking place. And one of the things that we did see, and I think is important, so in terms of the workers and gender, very similar outcomes for workers and for women as we were seeing in global value chains. Potentially one of the downsides was that civil society organizations had less leverage over African retailers and buyers than maybe in Europe and North America, where those kind of campaigns had helped to leverage private standards, etc., and private labor standards. But what we did see, particularly in two of our countries, South Africa and Kenya, where we were focused, was increasing involvement by government in value chain oversight. So as value chains are kind of coming closer to the sort of domestic market, governments are getting more involved. I mean, I could go into more details of how. I'm a bit wary of time, but I mean, just one example in Kenya, the Kenyan government in horticulture had introduced legislation in 2019, which was literally a replica of private standards for horticulture applied by European supermarkets. It was almost a synthesis of it, both in terms of food standards and decent work, ethical trade, and the environment. So it's interesting that these changes are taking place. We did look in Kenya at how this was the impacts of this onto smallholders. Don't forget, Kenya is primarily smallholder production in horticulture. And what we did find were two things, which were unintended, but were the reality, which was firstly that when you introduce standards, and they were now being introduced, certification, or the equivalent of was now being introduced by the Kenyan government, you have to keep a record of everybody involved in handling or producing the fruit or the veg. Now, this whole thing about women being invisible, well, there's a record now because of certification of all women. It might be difficult to access it, but it's there. But the second thing we found is that in order to be certified, and the Kenyan government were really promoting this, smallholders had to be organised, they had to be in small producer organisations. And when we compared small producer organisations with we found that the women who were critical to production did much better in the small SPOs and the small producer organisations than not. And so there were potentially, often unintended, empowering implications. But again, this might be something that would have to be picked up on. But I think a key thing in all my research, so governments are getting more involved, but I think a key thing in all my research is at the end of the day, it's down to the struggles. It's, promoting gender equality is not going to be easy. It's something that you have to campaign hard for. It's never been otherwise in Europe or North America, and I don't think it's going to be any different in Africa, Asia, or Latin America.
Right. Just a quick follow-up question on that. So it's interesting, you're saying that the Kenyan government, right, has adopted new kind of a code on labor rights in the context of global value chains. And just if you can quickly tell us what was driving that. Was it actually worker organization that drove that?
Yes, now in that particular, it was horticulture, so fruit and vegetables, fresh fruit and vegetables. It was two things that probably were the primary drivers, which were that the European Union had been blocking imports or controlling imports into Europe from Kenya because they weren't meeting the standards. And the second reason was increase in rates of cancer within Kenya itself, both of which were attributed to poor standards in small scale horticulture, and that produce seeping into exports and seeping into the Kenyan markets. So the Kenyan government realized that they had to tighten up. But Kenya also, you see, context really matters. So you can't generalize, and that's been another very important finding in my research. Kenyan constitution in 2010 also strengthened greatly gender equality. So you now have at least a third of any organization has to be female. So it was when you put all of that together, right, that you then got this positive gender outcome, or potentially positive gender outcome, very important.
Right. No, that's a great example. And actually your book is full of such rich examples and descriptions of how, certain factors work together to create a situation of economic upgrading and downgrading, of course, without taking away the agency of workers and firms in the process. So I'm going to stop here because we really would like to get all of you involved and take some questions. So we have about 12 minutes for questions. I see that there might be, you can also post them in the chat, but I encourage you to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself. So we see there is one in the chat from Shraddha Jain. How did you reach out to brands and local manufacturers for your research material? They would have been hardest to reach out to. And how far has a fair trade campaign helped in global collectivization to negotiate with employers and the states?
Yeah, no, great question. So I think just in terms of reaching out, no, I agree. I think that early research was easier because when I first approached TEDCO, for example, no one had approached them to be interviewed about how their value chain works, whereas now they would probably be more reticent, but or just time-wise, because there are many more researchers in this field if not reticent. One of the things I have discovered, and this is, I think, collaboration with researchers, and it's one of the advantages of working on global value chains. We have a good division of labour that the researcher in country, say in Kenya, Maggie Apondo, University of Nairobi, she leads all the local research, I lead on the global dimension, and then we kind of meet together somewhere across the African continent. In other words, we bring it together, and that's particularly on the global value chain research been very important. And I think at a local level, if you're working with researchers who are very well embedded and understand the local dynamics, they know ways of getting in and getting access. But I think one of the things that's always interesting, and it varies a lot by context as to how difficult it is or how easy it is. Some it's more difficult, others it's easier. But one of the things I have learned in relation to the kind of global brands is often when you first approach them, they don't particularly want to talk to you, they're too busy, whatever. when they realize that you've already been at the base of their supply chain and you know a lot about what's going on in their supply chain, they then begin to want to talk to you because they want to find out what you know. So, and I do think on the fairer trade campaigns, I think I haven't really had time to talk about them. I think that there are a lot of fairer, I would call fair and ethical trade initiatives. I think they've been very important. Whether they've been sufficient to really address what we call the purchasing practices of these big global multinationals, I think that's been a challenge all the way through. But certainly, I think that they have played an important role. I'm not sure that it's so far been sufficient to really address the issues as we know now in post-COVID.
Thanks, Stephanie. George Williams, you want to ask your question?
Hi, thank you. Hi, everybody. So I've been aware of Stephanie's work for a number of years. I used to work at an NGO called Tradecraft Exchange that had some relationships with Stephanie's work over the years, which was always fantastic. I currently work at an organization called Practical Action, and what we're seeing, or what we have a large focus on, is the accelerating climate crisis, and the fact that the climate crisis is having gendered impacts, and in some ways setting things back for women. And I wondered if this is coming through in the research on global value chains. To what extent is the climate crisis driving either positive change or negative change in terms of those chains? Thanks.
Yes, no, it is. Hi, George. Yeah, I was involved with Tradecraft many years ago, so sad to see that it's no longer with us. So I think the climate change dimension is really, really important, and it's not something I specialize in, but because of something I learned a long time ago, it's having the research network. So I work very closely and collaboratively with others that do, and I think the climate change, the whole environmental and climate change dimension is getting a lot of value chains. I mean, there's obviously a lot of work out there, but with a specific value chain focus is now getting a lot of attention. And I do think that there is a strong gender dimension to it. And some of the research that I've seen, and I haven't systematically looked at it, but some of the research indicates that women, particularly, certainly in agri-food, because of this issue, and in agriculture, where women are often involved in production but don't get the kind of support, women are often more adversely affected than men. So I think there is research showing that. And I also, from some of the kind of research that I'm seeing, and even from some of the companies, are beginning to realize that they need to really connect what they do on the environmental side and what they do on the social side, and that those two, you're not going to achieve positive results if you don't do that. And I think we did see that to some extent in cocoa. And there's these big issues around deforestation in cocoa, and I think there you're beginning to bring the two together. And then organisations like Practical Action and others have been very, very much at the forefront of trying to make those connections as well in terms of specific projects. And I think that's fairly critical. But I think from the value chain perspective, it's probably lagging behind to some extent in terms of making the connections, but it's definitely, there are a number of very good researchers who are focused on it, including from a gender perspective.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks for your question, George. I think
very important in the track that Tradecraft Exchange is now Transform Trade and does a lot of very important work in leveraging change, particularly in relation to governments and as well as companies.
Caroline, I think you had your hand up, but I don't see it up anymore. You're on mute. Caroline,
I think it's still up. I think the background's changed. I wanted to thank you for this session. I mean, both your comments, Sheba and Stephanie, your insights. I mean, this is fascinating, and I have many, many, many questions I'd love to ask you, but I'm, given the interest of time, I'll have to hold them over for another time. There's one issue that I struggle with, and I'd be really curious to hear your take on it. Last year, I was asked to write a piece on some foreign aid, some governmental foreign aid in agricultural value chains, particularly in West Africa, to help, to empowerment women, or to make women's lots better. And so, things like, improving, we'll think some of the examples you've given, helping women have access to some technical knowledge to improve, growing, but also, how could women producers have their products certified, better, and so on. And I'm sure that these programs funded by public money did lead to positive outcomes for many of the women involved, better revenue, more safe, more predictable revenues for these women. But the problem that I had was that ultimately all this money was going to sort of safeguard Olam or other big, commodity exporters' supply chains. And so, yes, maybe these women who were the producers were, earning a bit more and great. But on the other hand, who was really benefiting? This public money was actually really benefiting the big, already wealthy actors. And I really struggled with this because I thought, well, you're not going to be against a better situation for these women who are, at the early stages of the value chains. But, how do you resolve it? And how also do you resolve it in a non-ideological way? I mean, what are you going to say to these women? No, because it is ultimately an extractive relationship, big Western, companies extracting raw materials from poorer countries. So what are we going to do? Say to these women, well, just starve until the Marxist revolution happens. How can one be non-ideological and constructive in calling out, in a sense, this relationship?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good question, and it's a constant challenge, and particularly in relation to donor aid, which I'm not the greatest fan of. I mean, you also have people like Olam who themselves have quite big programs, some of which have a strong gender dimension to them. Now, clearly, they do it. The big commercial companies do it, and I think the donors tend to go side with them. By the way, I felt there was much too close a relationship there, but that's just a personal opinion from a distance. But the key there, though, is obviously the commercial companies only do it for commercial reasons. I mean, just like the example I gave earlier, that they realized if they didn't train women, which is what they now do, they train all farmers in the community so that women can participate, whereas before it was all done elsewhere and it was only the men farmers that went. So just small things like that have made, and I think they do make a difference, particularly when combined with other strategies, often done at local level with local NGOs and local civil society organizations, to help to empower, I'm a bit wary of using the word empower, but certainly enhance the well-being and the livelihoods of women. And I think my view is that you need to do that, particularly in smallholder agriculture. But ultimately, and the kind of campaigns like Behind the Brands can kind of help push companies further along than just simply doing it in a purely commercial way, which companies would be quite happy to do. But I do think ultimately, and this is where analysing the whole dynamics of value chains is important, because I mean, if you take West Africa, cocoa's my kind of speciality. I've been 70% of the world's cocoa supply comes from West Africa, so it's a pretty important in West Africa. One of the things that's really starting to shift the dial a little bit in relation to those really big commercial companies are not those kinds of donor initiatives, but it's the Ghanaian and the Cote d'Ivoirean governments jointly standing up to the large cocoa companies and cocoa buyers and saying, if you don't pay a reasonable price, we're not selling to you. And now that is the kind of thing that then really starts to drive change, where they then guarantee their goal and the way they operate the value chain within Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire is that they make sure that farmers are paid sufficiently, not necessarily with a gender focus, but when you bring the kind of different strategies together, I think then you have the potential for change. But I think the point that I made earlier is that ultimately change really only comes about through contestation. I've never really seen significant change within value chains or outside without some form of contestation. And don't forget, contestation in the book is individual, collective and collaborative. The civil society campaigns being the collaborative, collective being more the trade union organization. You don't get much of that in small scale agriculture, but you're beginning to through SPOs. But individual is simply exit. And that has had a big impact onto a lot of these large companies, because farmers are just, young farmers are leaving because it's very poor, very unequal, etc. And that also is another driver of change. So contestation can take many forms, and it's forcing governments and companies to realize they do have to look after and reward farmers better, including women.
All right, so we're sort of out of time, but I would still like to squeeze in one last question from Cheyenne. Cheyenne?
Hi, thanks. Just want to express gratitude to this event and also to you, Stephanie. I've learned so much every time I read anything, and like Sheba said, both in terms of approach and methodology. I also wanted to ask, just from a professional standpoint, sometimes scholars in economics, at least, feel kind of torn between writing for academia and writing for everybody else. And you so well balance this. Your work is so teachable. And also it seems like you're just handing like good thinking to policymakers and civil society all along these different contests. And I was just wondering if you could just speak for a minute about whether this was intentional early on, or you began to, orient your writing as you wanted, or just like how you had that balance between sort of academia and everybody else.
Oh yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, no, it's a challenge. I mean, I went into academia late, so I worked for a number of years before I went to university. So that was where I really got my interest, I think, in labour issues and including gender discrimination, because I certainly experienced it. So I think that's helped. My background helps. But I do think also I've always I've deliberately always wanted to do research that would inform. I'm not a campaigner, but that would inform. And so therefore you do have to try and present information in a way that is accessible. If it's not accessible, then you might as well not write it, unless you're purely interested in an academic career, which was never my sole intention. But I think also very importantly, what I've learned over the years is you have to translate. So I feel like I write in two different languages. So if I write for academia, it tends to be long paragraphs, longer sentences, more analytical. If you write for another type of audience, a more kind of practitioner audience, it has to be very short, sharp, not too long. So I do a lot of briefings, and I'm not very good on blogs, which I should get better at, but I do a lot of briefing papers over the years. And I kind of just basically to try and translate to the different audiences. It's not easy. It means you have to put more grease in and more time in. But for me, that was always important. And I've always collaborated with NGOs and with companies. I mean, I get criticized for it, but I think that's how I really find out what's going on. My condition always is that I can publish, so long as I can publish, and then everyone can access the information, anonymized or whatever, but the information's out there, and that's always been a criteria. So yeah, hopefully it's good to hear that you do find it accessible. So
thank you, Stephanie, for those thoughts and those tips. And many of us will find it very useful. And perhaps, your question, Cheyenne, is a good way, to segue into what we wanted to ask Stephanie, is ask a sort of final question, which is, if you can share with us what has been rewarding for you about this work, and why you would encourage more feminist economists to take up this kind of research, and perhaps if you also want to lay out some research gaps, or what do you think is a critical research agenda in this field, that would be very helpful for us.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I think, certainly rewarding. When I first started this work, as I said, in Chile, women were just unseen, unrecognized, didn't exist, invisible. So I think what has been rewarding is the fact that visibility has been increased, that big NGOs, that doesn't surprise me with the NGOs, because they long had a gender focus, but that they picked up on value chains as a important way of as one of the kind of ways and tools in which they can try and implement change, but also companies. I mean, to be working with Cadbury's and later Mondelez, trying to promote gender equality. And I mean, certainly the people I directly work with, many of them come from NGOs, so they have that background, which would have been, I mean, unimaginable 20 or 30 years ago. So I think I've seen a lot of change. I think the challenges have also increased just as much. So there's no resting on your laurels here. In terms of the gaps, I do think this issue, for me at the moment, anyway, maybe this is what I'm focused. Well, two things. Firstly, is what roles can governments play? I haven't had time to mention it, but the EU has just recently introduced, or European Commission recently, a year or so ago, introduced legislation on supply chain due diligence on environment and human rights. Now, that's for all big buyers or selling into EU markets, all big companies selling into EU markets across the whole global supply chain. That's going to be really interesting. Might have limited effect, but it certainly provides potential leverage. So that's an important issue, and what roles do governments play in countries? But I think also on the bigger agenda, this so-called deglobalization, I think what you are seeing is more of a separation between a kind of North America, EU-led group, and obviously the China and Russia. Now, how that plays out from a value chain perspective is going to be very interesting. But in a situation where in many countries in Asia, Africa and Latin America are evolving their own value chains, and how that, the implications for that and how it's evolving. And I think it's very likely to evolve differently in different countries, in different locations and across different types of supply chain. But I think there's a lot more work there to be done. And then what are the implications of that for women workers? And how can we leverage change that promotes greater gender equality? I've lost confidence in governments alone a long, long time ago. But I think when value chains open up, unintended often leverage points, and you have to be looking for those leverage points. But that context is rapidly changing. We need to keep very close tabs on it.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for this very rich and engaging discussion. We've learned a lot from everything that you've shared with us. And maybe if I can just add a couple of things to the research agenda based on my own research. I think Stephanie's book also sort of dives into this too in some detail, which is the rise of digital technologies, the rise of robotic technologies and automation, and the impact that this is going to have on workers in global value chains, and how this is actually going to change the nature of work itself. And there is some quantitative work that's been done on that, but there's a lot of scope for actual field work and study of labor practices, of work organization on the shop floor. So there's a lot to be done on that. And so I would encourage people to take that up as well. And maybe I'll just sort of end by saying that people have pointed to this already, that Stephanie's work is really interesting because it combines really rigorous scholarship along with, this political content and with a view to make real social change. And this is why her work has been so impactful and has been, so well received, not only in the academic community, but has actually contributed to making change in people's lives on the ground. So there's a lot to learn from Stephanie and from her approach, and a lot also to build on in terms of, what she's already achieved and accomplished in terms of her findings and in terms of her research and publication. So thank you very much to everyone who joined here, and I will turn it back to Mary. And thanks to Stephanie.
Can I just add to that? Just thank you to both you, Sheba, and to Mary, and to everybody who participated. I think there've been some excellent questions.
Thank you so much. And let me echo just so much of what's been said about my appreciation for your work, Stephanie. It was very impactful for me, and the opportunity to work with you as a graduate student on the Capturing the Gains project was incredible. And to Sheba, whose work as well has been incredibly impactful for me. Both of you, I respect your work so much and only can hope to take this research agenda forward. So thanks to everyone as well who joined the session. I think we had really, as I said, great questions and a lot to take forward from here. I mentioned earlier that we do have a lot of upcoming events on different event tracks, including more Fireside Chats, but on other event series as well. The next one to look out for is actually this week, which is us kicking off our regional event series. It's going to be a regional gender economics dialogues on care in Central Asia. It's actually going to be in Russian, but we're going to have live interpretation. This is going to be on Friday, April 28th at 11 a.m. Astana time. So I am going to put the link quickly in the chat for registration, but you should have that in your email boxes as well. So looks like the hyperlink didn't come through. So we'll send that a reminder for that. But thank you all again. Hope that you got a lot out of this session and the resources that were shared. Thank you for Mubi for putting that in there. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, all.
Thank you.